I'm Maureen, and this is Spilled Salt, a podcast on the thrills and spills from the food, beverage, and agriculture industries. Today's guest is Chris Laughton. He's the Director of Knowledge Exchange at Farm Credit East for the Northeast of the U.S. And Chris's role is really about education and outreach for up-and-coming farmers or existing farmers that are looking to continue their knowledge and expertise in the agriculture industry. So he says that they serve all of agriculture, and some of what we talk about today is some of the ways that they do that, not only with the education side of things, from people and leadership and financial, to lending and some of the programs that Farm Credit East has available to folks that are looking to continue to grow and scale their agricultural business venture. So we talk about that a little bit on the podcast today, as well as some of the great stories that Chris has experienced in his 13 years at Farm Credit East, as well as some of what he sees forthcoming for the agriculture industry. Enjoy the conversation. Hey, Chris, how are you?
Good afternoon. I'm doing well.
Good. Thanks so much for joining me today for this conversation.
Oh, you're welcome. Glad to be here.
Yeah, excellent. So I'm going to jump right in, and you wore the perfect shirt for today. I don't know if you planned that to be on the podcast today, but I know you've been at Farm Credit East for a long time, 13 years according to your LinkedIn profile. Can you talk a little bit about your work?
Yeah, so I'm Director of Knowledge Exchange at Farm Credit East, which is a sort of a fancy title that doesn't really explain what I do, but it sounds good, right?
It does sound good.
Yeah, so basically what it means is that I run our customer education and outreach programs. So like, for example, today I've spent a lot of time working on our Generation Next program, which is basically a leadership training course for emerging ag leaders, people that are, say, the next generation of a family business that are going to take on more responsibility, or beginning farmers or that sort of thing. And it talks about managing people, leadership, financial management, operations, that sort of thing.
Yep. And what kind of things are you teaching them? Like you mentioned people, leadership, finances, but what are some of the core skills that an emerging leader in agriculture needs to know?
Yeah, well, one of a big part of the program, like it's normally, when it's in person, it's offered as 3 full days of instruction that are spaced a few weeks apart, to give people a chance to,
absorb it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And the entire first day is on human resource management and leadership. So it's a big focus of the program. And sometimes we get a little bit of pushback from like beginning farmers. They might say, well, I don't have any employees yet, or that sort of thing. But one of the things that we say is that at some point in your career, whether you're a beginning farmer or taking on an established operation, you're going to reach a point at which you can no longer do everything yourself. And getting things done through others is an important skill to develop if you ever want to grow beyond what one person can do. And so we talk about things like the difference between being a manager and being a true leader. Where a manager, you're kind of like top-down command control, that sort of thing. Whereas a leader, you're almost more of a servant to your staff, if you will,
right,
and helping bring out the best in them, and building a high-performance team. So we talk about that. We also talk about financial management. What are financial statements? How to create and read a balance sheet. How to create a cash flow budget. How to approach a lender. What a lender's going to want to see from you. The importance of record keeping. And other things like that. We talk about risk management, managing risk of all different types related to your farm. And that's just one of our programs. I also do a lot of speaking to groups, either in webinars or live events. I have a talk called Business Basics for Beginning Farmers that I give a lot. I do a lot of outreach to try and, at Farm Credit East, our objective is to serve all of agriculture. So big, small, organic, conventional, all different types, as well as forest products and fishing. So kind of the nexus of them is that they're all natural resource-based businesses.
Yep.
And, so, and not everyone is aware of us, even though we've been around for 100 years.
Well,
So,
I think especially this side of the business, right? Like I think Farm Credit East is well known as a lender, right,
yeah,
from the debt side of the business, but this knowledge exchange, and I know we've talked before, but I can think of a number of folks who are trying to take a side hustle ag business to full time, right? And they need this kind of direction.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I do a lot of outreach to try and make sure that people are aware that we're here, as well as just basic education for the financial management side of agriculture.
Yeah.
Not a lot of people get into farming because they love paperwork and record keeping. That's not typically the core thing that they're seeking, but it's an essential skill to develop if you want to be successful in agriculture.
Yeah. Yeah.
We leave the kind of bugs and plants to extension,
Yep.
but we saw when we began, and it's changed somewhat. Extension has gotten a lot more offerings on business management than they used to have.
Mm-hmm.
But
And you're talking about, just for everybody on the podcast, he's talking
yeah,
about Cornell Cooperative Extension Resources, which are county based and are around the state.
correct.
Yep.
But when we began the program, we saw a gap kind of in that financial management education piece,
Mm-hmm.
and we realized that as lenders, we saw more farmers get into trouble because of poor record keeping or poor financial management, more so than that because they were bad farmers.
Right. And I would imagine that that's true, especially for the generational community, right? That Gen 2, for example, right, it's passing to Gen 3, and maybe Gen 2 did it with a notebook, literal pen and paper, right, keeping track that way. And the next generation that's coming in wants to take over and learn the operations, but also wants to add their own spin to it, maybe modernize a little bit, take things into QuickBooks, and those are different kinds of things that the previous generation can't teach. They can teach, this is how I did it, and I can tell you this. But I would imagine that where Farm Credit East really shines is having that agriculture expertise makes a generation that's passing from one to the next really trust you to guide the next generation coming in that way.
So that's I guess a nutshell of my position. I also do a lot of like trade show events and things like that. And I was hired specifically for this role 13 years ago. And before that, I was actually a customer of Farm Credit East. I was in the greenhouse nursery business.
I saw that in your history that you grew up on a farm that did nursery.
Family nursery and greenhouses. So I took a little bit of a winding path. I started out, my first job, if you will, was helping Grampy in the greenhouse.
Yep.
And my first job was checking for bugs. I'd go around, and I think it was partly because I was very interested in bugs as a little boy.
Yeah.
Because it would just occupy me for hours. And
right, I'm sure.
After me, but he would set me loose in the greenhouse and, see if you can find any bugs for me to look at.
Yeah.
And so I would do that. So I grew up around the family, business and greenhouses, and worked for my undergrad degrees in horticulture from Cornell.
Yep.
And worked for my dad for 12 years. And then in 2006, he sold the company to another owner.
Okay.
So that sort of forced me to reevaluate my plans.
Mm-hmm.
And I ended up going back to school and getting an MBA at UMass Amherst.
Mm-hmm.
And then joined Farm Credit East shortly thereafter. And since then, I've got a second master's degree in applied economics at UConn.
And so talk about that a little bit, right? Like, I mean, because you're right, that is a very winding path from horticulture to economics, but we love a winding path. That's one they make for great stories. So what is that like, in that shift?
So, when I started at Farm Credit East and started doing more like economic research and things like that, and industry outlooks, I wanted to get a stronger background in economic theory. I had some of that as part of my MBA curriculum, but Farm Credit East actually is a great tuition reimbursement program that I took advantage of.
Oh, great.
To basically send me to school to get a master's degree. So I went mostly at night in stores, and took, really just like one class a semester to kind of get through it while I was still working full time.
Yeah.
But I did a deeper dive into economics and got that degree. I wrapped that up in 2020, actually. So fairly recent. And I was, an older student taking the classes, but it keeps you young, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it speaks to your interest in learning, right? Which for the role that you have at Farm Credit East, you kind of have to be a forever learner, right? Because things are constantly changing in what you're educating the next up and coming generation of farmers to learn and know. So I can see the trajectory for why you would want to
Yeah,
continue to lengthen your experience in that field.
because a lot of what I do is taking information from other sources and kind of trying to make it
Right.
digestible and actionable to Northeast farmers.
Yeah.
So I do a lot of like I'll look at what data comes out of USDA, and I'll try to put my thinking cap on and think about if I was a Northeast farmer, how would I use this information, or how would this information affect me? And I
Yeah.
try to write reports and articles and outlooks that reflect that perspective.
And how can our listeners tap into that kind of content? Like, where can they subscribe to get a hold of that when you put new reports out?
Yeah, so farmcrediteast.com is our website.
Hmm.
I frankly I write most of the content that's on our website, like in
Hmm.
terms of reports and whatnot. I don't do the fancy graphic design, but I do the writing.
Yep.
We have a blog that comes out typically once or twice a week called Today's Harvest,
Hmm.
which I contribute to quite a bit, and then also our monthly e-newsletter called the Knowledge Exchange Partner um, comes out monthly, and I am responsible for either writing that or commissioning someone else to write an article for it.
Yeah.
And if someone wants to subscribe, they can check us out on the website, or they can just shoot me an email, and I'll make sure they get added to the list.
Cool. That sounds great. You
You
know,
don't have to necessarily be a customer to get it.
right. Yep. Great. That's awesome. I think that skill that you're talking about, the ability to digest a number of different sources of information and boil it down to its most simplistic form that, like you said, farmers can apply to their own businesses or even understand how to apply, right? I grew up on a dairy farm, and so one of the things that I think gives us an edge at Agency 29 is that I can go meet a farmer and we speak the same language, right?
Yeah.
Because it is, kind of there's an approach, right? You have
Hmm.
to give it to me straight, right? That's kind of
Yeah.
how the farmer wants it. They want to be able to very simply understand information. So I can see the value of that.
Hmm.
Yeah. You're also program manager for Farm Start. Can you talk about Farm Start too? A little
Yeah.
bit?
So at Farm Credit, like I mentioned, we describe ourselves sort of as a Big Ten organization. Like
Yeah.
we strive to serve all of agriculture, and a big part of that means serving young, beginning, and small farmers. That's
Hmm.
part of our mission, as dictated to us by the federal government, and we have to report annually on both quantitative and qualitative goals. So, like numerical goals of how many loans we make to beginning farmers,
Mm,
that sort of thing, as well as qualitative goals like what outreach activities we did, what educational program we offered, that sort of thing.
yep.
And so, for a big part of our beginning farmer programs um, is Farm Start. It's not the entirety of it, but
Hmm.
it's one of our focus areas. And what Farm Start does is it fills a gap that we saw in providing capital for startup or early stage farms.
Hmm.
In that it provides an unsecured investment. What that means is,
Hmm.
if you want to buy real estate, for example, you could get a mortgage for that, and the real estate secures the loan.
Right.
So the lender has security, and that's something that you can do if provided you can afford the payments, right?
Hmm.
But that gets you land. You still need to maybe buy a tractor, buy some seeds, hire
Right.
somebody, build, dig a well, what have you.
Yep.
So Farm Start was designed to provide that operating capital piece that's hard to collateralize from a
Yeah.
lender's perspective,
Hmm.
because we saw a lot of beginning farmers either struggling to cover those expenses or doing things like maxing out all their credit cards or
Right.
whatever else. So Farm Start provides an affordable entry point to get up to $75,000 in capital
Hmm.
for that unsecured expenses, and they have up to 5 years to pay it back, or roll it into conventional financing. Presumably, after the end of 5 years, they'd be more credit worthy, if you will. They'd be
Yep.
more able to get a traditional bank loan.
Yeah.
So Farm Start requires no down payment and no collateral.
Yeah.
And we've done almost 400 of them
Mm-hmm.
over the last 18 years now.
Mm-hmm.
And our success rate is very high. One of the reasons is that we try to pick winners. We try to pick people that have a high likelihood for success.
Yeah.
And B, we when you get a farm start investment, it comes with an advisor. So you're
Great.
expected to meet with your advisor at least twice a year
Mm-hmm.
and just check in on how things are going, and be willing to make changes, because in a startup or an early stage business, which I'm sure you totally identify with, having started not too long ago yourself,
Mm-hmm.
it never goes completely according to plan, right?
Right.
So, maybe your plan was to market in one way, but you need to pivot to another market because things
Yeah.
didn't work out exactly right. And so
Mm-hmm.
that's the purpose of that, biannual check-in
Mm-hmm.
with your advisor.
Yeah, I would imagine that the other benefit of that too is, the Farm Credit East network is so knowledgeable about what may be available to you that you may not be aware of too, right? So it could also be that maybe you're a good candidate for certain kind of grant funding that your advisor can bring to your attention, which is further going to benefit, that farmer as well as like the greater goals of the grant organization.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or whatever you're doing, we've probably seen it before.
Right.
You might be able to offer some advice or some perspective on what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
Because one of the things with Farm Start, because by its nature, it's a startup program, we've done a lot of unique and unusual businesses with
Mm-hmm.
Farm Start. So it's definitely not limited to, dairy or corn growing or
Right. Like a straightforward farming operation.
yeah, we've
Yep.
done a lot of unusual businesses, and we've also done some forestry and some fishing in there too. We've done
Mm-hmm.
a few lobster boats for fishermen. We've done some forestry people. We've bought skidders for a logger that wanted to
Mm-hmm.
do a custom service. Skidder for hire service
Yep.
for logging company. We've done a lot of like vegetable and CSA and farmers
Yeah.
market type farms.
Mm-hmm.
Um, we even have one that's a saffron grower in Vermont. That I'll admit that was one we did have to look up because we haven't seen that one before. And we found out that yes, you can actually grow it in a cold climate. It's basically what it is. It's like the pollen of a crocus bulb, specific variety of crocus.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yep.
And it goes for a lot of money.
Yes, it does.
But it requires some certain skills and talent to produce it at scale. But we found someone that or he came to us,
Mm-hmm.
a couple that wanted to do it, and they've managed to make it work very well actually so far. So
That's great.
they're one of
And
our.
so, Chris, do you also do would you do a controlled environment agriculture type
Yeah,
operation
so
too?
we've done some of those like shipping container
Yep.
farms where it's like a converted shipping container, and they have vertical farming equipment inside of it. And basically what it is, you have to provide a pad and electricity and water, and they place it there, and then you go and farm it.
Yep. Yep.
And
There's a business out of Buffalo. I don't know if that's the same one that you're talking about, but that
well,
does that.
we've done a couple of them,
Yeah.
and those have worked out pretty well. There's some large scale vertical farms and greenhouse vegetable farms that have popped up too. Like several of them are on the metro New York City area at a larger scale, and we've done a little bit of financing work with them through our regular Farm Credit East, higher dollar loans
Mm-hmm.
also.
And so let's go there for a minute. Can you
Sure.
talk about some of the kind of more traditional related to what we've just been talking about, but approach and lending that Farm Credit East does in general for farms?
Yeah, sure. So we have a wide range of customers. I would say our median customer, if you go back to like your college level statistics, you have mean and median, or your
Yep.
average and median. So average gets pulled up because we have some large multi-million-dollar loans, but the median customer, like by number of loans, is a small or mid-sized farmer.
Okay.
I would say that our median loan is probably a couple $100,000, which for a land mortgage is not that big.
Mm-hmm.
But it ranges from very small, even part-time farmers that have horses or grow some hay in the backfield, and have a regular W-2 job,
Mm-hmm.
to full-time farmers, to large cooperatives that market milk or cranberries or what
Yeah.
have you. Dairy is our biggest sector by far, mostly
Mm.
comes from New York and Vermont. I should mention that our service area is the 6 New England states, and then New York and New Jersey.
And that's
So that's
for your segment of Farm Credits, but
the
Farm
farm credit
Credits has
system.
other
Yeah,
chapters around the country, right?
yeah. Well, the farm credit system is national and
Yeah.
covers all 50 states plus Puerto Rico, and it's made up of about 60 different independent associations that all have defined territories.
Mm-hmm.
So our territory is like I said, that 8-state Northeast region. To the south of us is Horizon Farm Credit, which is like a sister to
Mm-hmm.
us, and they service PA, Delaware, Maryland, and part of Virginia.
Mm-hmm.
It's like their territory, and then everyone else has kind of different spots.
Yep.
Yeah, that's our service area, and the whole system was created by Congress in 1916
Hmm.
To serve rural America. Basically, at the time, American landscape looked a lot different. There was a lot of farming was much more prominent as in terms of percent of the population.
Yeah.
But there wasn't a lot of like bank loans available to rural businesses.
Mm-hmm.
Banks were concentrated in the cities and focused on industry and that sort of thing. And so they saw a gap in service providing for rural America, and that's how we were created. So we were created by the government, but we're not a government agency. They kind of created us and then spun us off. And we're now organized as farmer-owned cooperatives. So the farmers own us.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Yeah. When you take out a loan from Farm Credit East, it comes with stock, and you become a owner of the cooperative, and you can vote for our board of directors. You can run for our board of directors, for that matter. And our board of directors are, I believe, a 16-member board that's mostly farmers that are elected by their peers to kind of oversee our organization.
Yeah. Wow, that's great. I didn't realize that detail.
Yeah.
So tell me about, and you talked about some of the most interesting projects you've worked on in your career. You talked about the saffron farmers, but what other kind of operations or projects have you worked on over the last 13 years, or even going back to the greenhouse and nursery days? What are some of the most interesting stories or projects from your career?
Sure. Yeah, some of the most interesting ones are definitely ones that are sort of outside the norm, if you will. So they're not necessarily I wouldn't call them the average customer, but it's kind of cool to say you did them, or be able to talk about them. So we have one customer in Maine that's growing kelp.
Oh yeah.
Seaweed. That's kind of an emerging thing.
Yep.
And they're growing that as basically a food additive. There's a limited market for seaweed, just eating it on its own.
Yeah.
But there's a much bigger market as a food ingredient. So you can get like a kelp burger that's made of one of those plant-based burgers. It's made with like seaweed and mushrooms and maybe soybeans or something else, and it's supposed to mimic the burger flavor.
Right.
So that's an interesting one that we're doing.
I think kelp, because I recently looked into this, because there was a company that applied for the Grow New York competition, and I do a first round review of those applications. And there was a company that was doing kelp farming somewhere in the Northeast, and I wonder if it's the same one, but I can't remember the name. And I want to say that they were also looking at the beauty industry for kelp as well, that there was some application there.
Yeah, there could be like components of the kelp that are valuable for cosmetics or something like that.
Yeah.
Another customer on the larger side of scale is a milk components company. What they do is they're a farmer-owned cooperative. There was about a dozen farmers that came together and wanted to basically think outside the box in terms of milk marketing, and not just serve the gallon jug market in the grocery store, but create some sort of higher value products and go for export markets and more specialty products. And so they basically take in raw milk from dairy farms, pasteurize it, break it down, and then they isolate like the proteins for energy drinks. The whey protein can be used for that.
Yep.
They make milk powder. They make products for like infant formula.
Hmm.
They make various isolates for like specialty cheeses and different products, and it's
Yeah.
all very value added and very niche products, and I would say more than half their stuff is exported
To other countries.
other countries like Europe or Asia.
Interesting. Huh. Well, I know that.
$1 million company, so they're on the larger side of the scale.
Yeah. Wow.
Well, there's a lot of interesting different things that we've been doing. Forest products are a lot of innovation there. We have one customer that's and environmental sustainability and renewable energy and that sort of thing is a big part of the mix as well. We have, for example, a sawmill that's completely self-sufficient in terms of energy. They created a wood-fired power plant that powers their whole sawmill, as well as they sell power to the grid from the waste wood, sawdust, and chips that the sawmill creates.
Yeah.
And so they're creating a whole, they're powering themselves in basically a totally renewable way, because it's all, forest products sourced from the local forest, which regenerates in Maine.
Yep.
So
that's cool. What are some, you mentioned, I love the way that Farm Credit East thinks about things in terms of some of the challenges that you see and what could Farm Credit East do to solve them. Like the Farm Start program, I think, is a perfect example of that. We saw this need and we filled it. And so even if your answer to this is something outside of what Farm Credit East could do, what are some of the big challenges that you're still seeing in agriculture?
Sure. Well, it depends on how you're situated. For example, like if you're a beginning farmer and you're coming into the industry from outside of agriculture, so you're not inheriting a business, there's a real challenge to come up with the capital needed to start a farm really of any size.
Yeah.
And that's a problem that's not unique to agriculture. I mean, we talk about it. Sometimes I think we forget that it's not unique to agriculture. We talk about the beginning farmers are, it's so hard, but it would be hard to start almost any business.
Right.
If you're going to start a car wash, you'd have to buy land and build a building and, everything else. So yeah, to start a beginning farmer, you have to secure real estate. You have to, buy equipment. Maybe you have to buy, whatever stock for whatever you're growing, all that kind of stuff. And, the profit margins in agriculture mean that there's typically a long payback period for that investment, 20, 30 years to repay the initial investment that you have to come up with. So that's a real challenge. And I think there's a lot of organizations that are working on helping that. Farm Credit East is working on it, with our Farm Start program. We also have, we collaborate with the USDA Farm Service Agency. Things like loan guarantees, which can help make a deal work that might otherwise be too risky to be approved. We also collaborate with the Farm Service Agency on down payment assistance. Typically, like most lenders, we would require a 20% down payment on real estate, and that's a big nut to crack if you're coming into agriculture from outside. But with the USDA down payment assistance program, you can get that down to 5%. And that's a lot more feasible. Yeah. And then the USDA, the portion of that, it's sort of like 15% of the value of the land. It goes from 20 to 5. That tranche or that slice of financing is at a low interest rate and at a pretty favorable term, so you can afford to do it. You still have to cash flow the business and make sure you can make all your payments and everything, but it makes it it provides a much better entry point. For other farmers that are more established, the biggest challenge that we hear about all the time is labor and workers, and both the cost and as well as just finding them and keeping them and all of that. I think all farmers want to treat their workers well and pay them well. But payroll is like the number one cost, the number one line item on the budget for almost any kind of agriculture. And so making sure that you can make that payroll every week can be a big challenge, especially if you're a farmer where you plant in the spring and harvest in the fall and you get one check a year,
Right.
trying to cash flow that for 12 months and make weekly payroll can be a big, that takes some planning.
Right.
And that's where like we do a lot of lines of credit for farmers where they'll, they'll draw it down the first 6 months a year and then pay it back the last 6 months.
Yeah.
As their revenue comes in.
Right.
So yeah, there's a lot of ways that we try to help meet those needs for agriculture.
Yeah. And last question for you.
Yeah, sure.
Predictions on what's next for the agriculture industry. What do you think are some of the big things coming down the pike?
Boy, that's a big question. And that could be a long answer. But I think that there's a lot. I'm bullish on Northeast agriculture. I mean, I think that there are challenges, and I think that if you talk to almost any farmer, you're going to get a laundry list of complaints. But if you can get past that, you can realize that farmers are eternal optimists.
Yes.
They have to be, because to put a seed in the ground and bank on the fact that that's going to grow and then pay off, and then someone's going to buy it and pay you 6 months later, that requires a
pretty wild
amount of optimism. So, if you can get past the initial sort of curmudgeonness that we all sort of have sometimes, and I have some of it too in my own personality, but I think that a lot of farmers are very excited about the future. There's a lot of new technologies out there. There's a lot of new equipment and tech. I'm going to be speaking on a panel at Grow New York next week about
great.
robotics. Yeah, so I'm going to be talking about robotics and digital tech. We have some dairy farmers that are now using robotics and artificial intelligence they use the robotics to milk the cows and feed the cows, and then they use the AI to do things like monitor their health and activity. So if they'll see a cow that has a higher temperature or is moving around a lot, they'll think, something's going on. Maybe I need to have my vet take a look at that animal.
Yeah.
In fruit, we're seeing things like robotic pickers and pruners.
Yep.
And that doesn't eliminate the need for the human touch. It just kind of augments it.
Yes.
And we're also seeing some innovative marketing things going on where this whole, it's not new, but there's an ongoing push for more local in stores and in institutions. And so I think, the Northeast is a great place to farm. We have the world's biggest market, right on our doorstep, so to speak. From New York to Washington, D.C. is like half the population of the country almost. And we have water.
Right.
We're not on fire.
Yep.
Like
you better knock on wood, Chris. So far, yes.
Sometimes we have too much water, to be honest, but at least we're not in perennial drought the way some other parts of the country are. So I think that there's a lot of reasons to be positive. Look forward on Northeast agriculture with optimism.
Yeah. That's a great outlook. I totally agree. We're continuing to see a lot of really interesting applied technology for both farms directly as well as the whole ecosystem of agribusiness, from, supply chain and local sourcing and how to kind of prioritize local and optimize pricing and create efficiency and all of that.
Like our CEO, Mike Reynolds, said to me one time that, Northeast agriculture or Farm Credit East, we're 100 years old and we're just getting started.
Yeah.
There's we continue to grow and come out with new programs and services and things like that all the time, and add new customers and farmers are tremendously creative and innovative. So they're always coming up with new things for us to keep up with. Yeah.
That's a fantastic outlook. Well, thank you so much for taking the time for the conversation today. Really appreciate your insights and your background, and I'll make sure that anybody that I come across that's in the agriculture industry that's looking to start something, I'll send them your way. I didn't realize that all of those, the education that you're doing is so approachable and valuable, especially like a lot of our clients are generational businesses that are, kind of passing that baton from one to the next, as well as the beginning farmer stage. So it's invaluable information to be able to to have, especially from an industry expert like yourself. So
Great.
Thanks for taking the time. I'm Maureen Ballatori. For more information about the podcast, visit www.agency-29.com. If you have questions for me or you'd like to recommend a guest for a future episode, you can send a message using the contact form on the website. Like and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts so you never miss an episode.